If you're new to the channel, then welcome, and if you're returning to the channel, then welcome back. I just want to extend a quick thank you to all of you for tuning in. So I think it's safe to say that today is going to be a very interesting day, and we should all expect a very wild ride. But, we're kind of used to that lately anyway, so let's just see how it plays out. However, the most interesting part for me is going to be how the results of the election will impact the stock market and the economy as a whole, which brings us to today's video. All right, I know it's weird you're seeing me on a Tuesday, but it's election day, so I have to make a video today. It just wouldn't make sense to make a video on Wednesday talking about Tuesday. And yeah, I know I'm wearing a hat, which is unusual, but it's just because my hair is like a big mess right now, so just get used to it. Today, I wanted to take a risk by opening myself up to the internet for possible scrutiny and criticism by making predictions on what I think the effects of the election, or rather the results of the election, what kind of impact that will have on the stock market and the economy. Now, of course, there are a few big things already having an impact on the economy as a whole, and particularly the stock market. So I think we should kind of talk about those things first to kind of, lay the foundation about what's going on and what's kind of brought us to the point to where we are now. Number one is that before the pandemic hit, we were coming off of the longest bull run in the history of the country. Once the pandemic did hit us, it definitely had a big negative impact on the stock market and the economy as a whole. We saw one of the biggest recessions, or one of the biggest dips rather, in recent history that was caused by the uncertainty that played out by the pandemic. However, at this point, we have mostly recovered, at least from a stock market perspective. Now, just because we've seen a recovery in the stock market doesn't mean that the economy overall is very healthy, right? As I've talked about before, the stock market is just one indicator of the economy, and even though it gets used and abused by politicians as, if the stock market's up, then things are going good, that's really not the truth 100% of the time. The pandemic has caused a lot of, industries and people to lose their jobs or have to close down businesses for short periods of time, medium periods of time, or even completely have to shut down their businesses for good. Now, an early stimulus bill did help sustain some of that, so that way people were getting increased unemployment benefits. They were getting, small business loans that they could apply for to help keep things afloat. And even stimulus checks went out to kind of help stimulate the economy and get people spending money. Meanwhile, though, there were still people who were relatively unaffected, at least in a negative way, by the pandemic. And all they really had to deal with was, working from home for a little while. Some people have even been able to capitalize on the massive rebound that we've seen in the stock market. With all of the remote work that's going on, people from high cost of living areas like California have been able to take their money and spend it in places where it's much cheaper to live, and they'll get better things for their money, better houses for their money rather. Obviously, I don't want to dwell on that too much. I think we spent like the last 3 weeks talking about this topic. But again, some people have been very negatively impacted by the pandemic, and other people have, seen it or used it as an opportunity to advance. The third thing that I've noticed is that we've been starting to see a bit of a second wave or an increase of, cases when it comes to the pandemic. I guess you could see that we're really starting to see a second wave, especially with how many cases that we're seeing in certain states and even other places like Europe where they're back to a total lockdown state again. Now, combine these rising cases with the fact that we're heading into the fall and winter months where it's already cold and flu season and immune systems are weakened. This really doesn't seem like a very good situation. And I personally believe that it's pretty likely that we could even see some form of lockdown come to the United States as well. And it is this uncertainty about everything in the future that's really having an impact on the economy and even the stock market lately, where we've seen a bit of a downturn. The country has been waiting on some form of stimulus ever since the first bill was passed like 6 or 7 months ago, and we haven't seen still a second stimulus bill get passed, which we all know at this point that my prediction from a couple of videos ago saying that we weren't going to see anything until after the election was correct. And this has left a lot of economic experts worried because their prescription has been, we need some form of second stimulus in order to keep things alive in the economy. Again, at this point, obviously we're not going to see anything until after the election, and I still believe that we won't see anything until somewhere between January and March of next year. And it's that last point that brings us to where we are today, which is the presidential election. So with that in mind, first and foremost, if you're watching this and you're registered to vote and you haven't voted yet, go out and vote. Don't listen to people who are telling you that your vote is worthless or that even voting in general is meaningless. Just do your best to inform yourself about the candidates that you might want to vote for and get an idea of what their ideas and what their plans are for topics that you actually care about and are interested in. I mean, at the very least, you can even go online and take one of these political quizzes, and it'll tell you whose ideas and plans that you kind of align with and give you a potential candidate to vote for when it comes to the president. With that PSA out of the way, let's go ahead and tackle the topic of what I think the effects of the election will be, depending on who gets picked as the president, what kind of effect that will have on the stock market and the greater economy as a whole. The short version of all of this is that I believe the sentiment that seems to be going around online and on the news, where if Joe Biden is elected in the short term, we'll likely see a dip in the stock market. And if Donald Trump is reelected president, then there's a good chance that we'll see the stock market have a bit of an increase. Now, the longer version of that is it's really not just that simple, right? There's a lot of factors that go into this and why I believe something like this might happen in case of either candidate getting elected. When it comes to Joe Biden, the reason that I could see an actual downturn or a small recession in the economy if he gets elected, or not the economy, but rather the stock market, is because of his and Kamala Harris's plan when it comes to taxes. The big things are that they want to increase the corporate tax rate, and they want to increase taxes on individuals making over $400,000 when it comes to payroll taxes and capital gains tax. Now, when it comes to corporations, there's this belief that if the corporate tax rate goes and increases, then in order for those corporations to make up the money that they're losing by paying in taxes, that they really just end up raising the prices on the consumer so that way they can even it out. And as the middle class and the low middle class and really the consumers of the corporations, we end up paying for that tax for them. And when it comes to increasing taxes on individuals who make over $400,000 and things like payroll taxes and on capital gains tax, there's this belief that it disincentivizes people to invest in the stock market, especially when it comes to capital gains tax, because they end up having to pay more if they're trading frequently, and even still having to pay more when it comes to long-term capital gains tax. Now, I want to point out that I'm not saying I believe or disbelieve these ideas when it comes to Biden's tax plan and what the sentiment is, but really I'm just trying to point out what the sentiment is that I have observed online and what I think that, broadly speaking, what the people are thinking. Because when it comes to the stock market especially, it's really driven by people's emotions and what they're feeling. Ultimately, it's really driven by the psychology of the people who are participating in it. And so it's the combination of these things that makes me think if Joe Biden gets elected, that's why we would probably see a dip in the stock market. Now, when it comes to Donald Trump getting reelected, the reason that I think we could see an increase in the stock market is for a few reasons. Number one is part of his whole campaign and his platform has been that he's been responsible for one of the greatest economies that we've ever seen in the United States. And I'm not saying that he is or he isn't, but rather because that's such a big part of his campaign and you see it in news headlines, especially, obviously conservative leaning headlines, it's going to have that psychological effect on people that makes them think, if I vote for Donald Trump, then I'm going to, be voting for a great economy. And whether he's actually responsible for it or not, we can say that when it comes to the stock market, we have seen a pretty strong rebound even from the low numbers that we saw in the middle of March. The second and third reason that I think we could see an increase in the stock market and a perception of the economy being better overall is that Donald Trump has expressed two what I would consider pretty major tax cuts. The first is lowering the income tax rate on what would be considered the middle class. So I believe he's talked in the past about cutting down the tax rate from 22% down to 15% for people who make, I don't know if it was around $85,000 or $90,000 a year, but basically what we would consider the middle class in the US. Trump has also expressed a desire to make a tax cut on capital gains tax. So the combination of both of these things is that the middle class would feel more encouraged to spend because they're keeping more of their money that they earn as income because that tax rate has been lowered. And it encourages people to trade and invest in the stock market because they're seeing a decrease in the capital gains tax. And so with that kind of plan and campaign that he's running on, I really think it would encourage investors to continue investing in the stock market and trading stocks regularly. And it would also incentivize people or have people in the middle class spend more of their money that they end up keeping from their income tax. It's the combination of these things that I think would, cause a early increase in the stock market. Now, the key thing to keep in mind here is that whether it goes to Trump or Biden, their effects on the stock market and the economy as a greater whole are going to be short term. And that's why I said if Biden gets elected, we're going to see a short-term downturn in the stock market. And if Trump gets elected, we're going to see a short-term increase or boost in the stock market. What's really going to have an impact in one direction or the other when it comes to the medium and long term is their ability to put together and get a stimulus bill passed as quickly as possible. The other major factor is whether or not the country will have to go into a lockdown based on the increased impact that the pandemic is having. So when it comes to both Biden and Trump, they both have expressed a desire to get some kind of stimulus package passed if they're elected, if either of them are elected. And one potential negative from that is no matter which one you're voting for, we're going to see another big deficit. But still, it's obvious that something needs to be done when it comes to the economy and the stock market and getting a stimulus bill passed. And for both of them, it's really just a game of a race against the clock. Are they going to be able to pass something in time to where we don't see the economy, or rather the stock market, start to see a severe dip or recession? And the sentiment of a lot of economic experts seems to be the longer we wait, the longer the negative impacts that we'll see that are coming from this pandemic recession. And keep in mind that, like I've expressed in previous videos, I still think there's a lot of effects that we haven't even begun to see, especially when it comes to what's going on with the pandemic and seeing rising cases again. The massive curveball that's been thrown at both Biden and Trump is the potential for having to lock down again. And as we saw the first time, it does have a pretty negative impact on the stock market and definitely a negative impact on the economy as a whole, which ultimately leads me to this thought. In the medium to long term, which I would say medium term being about 6 months and long term being a year to year and a half, we'll probably see another major dip in the stock market and possibly a recession. And if that actually ends up happening, the only thing that's going to be able to help soothe that is probably some kind of vaccine that comes out to help curb or cure this pandemic. Until that time, I honestly expect a lot of volatility. There will be some periods where the stock market seems to be rebounding and doing really well, and we'll continue to see the stock market, take a downturn and possibly go into recessions at some point. All right, so those are my thoughts. Leave your comments down below letting me know what you think. Maybe you think I'm totally off base with all this stuff and you think the opposite of what I think. It's always good for me to get different perspectives. I think I spent a lot of time, maybe too much time, reading like doomer economic news. So I am trying to balance that out a little bit. But I don't know, I just don't see a positive outcome from all of this in either candidate in the medium to long term. We'll see something happen in the short term that could be positive from either one of them, especially if a stimulus bill, if a stimulus bill gets passed. But yeah, leave your comments down below. Like the video. It's going to let me know if you want to see more content like this. And yeah, let's see where we are next week. Until next time.